Ladies and gentlemen, today I have the pleasure to welcome Miss Kelsey Blackwell. She's a Northwestern graduate School of Journalism and author of Decolonizing the Body. Miss Kelsey, thank you very much for joining me on the Human Rights Ray.
Thank you so much for having me, Alpha. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Before we go into talking about your book and learning more about it, would you mind tell a little bit to my audience who is Kelsey Blackwell?
Yes. Okay, so my name is Kelsey Blackwell, as you mentioned, and I am a cultural somatics practitioner. And oftentimes when I say that, people say, well, what is that? And basically, somatics is working with the body, embodiment work, and looking at embodied patterns that we have maybe come by through our own history or through our family structures, and starting to uncover what those patterns are and how we can heal from them. And as you mentioned, I'm also a journalist, writer, author, and a lot of my work really focuses on the experiences of being racialized in America, particularly as a woman. So I work a lot with women of color.
You talk about color, and I truly believe race play an important role in United States. Can you tell us a little bit about your family background so people can have more understanding how you view race when it comes to you?
Yeah, so I identify as a Black woman. I was raised in a very white community in Utah, a very white, very conservative community by my mother and father. My mother is white, and her, our ancestry on her side comes from Germany and Scandinavia predominantly. And my father is Black, and his ancestors came over during the transatlantic slave trade from West Africa. And I've done some DNA tests to get a sense of where my people come from, and predominantly Nigeria, though we also have some ancestry in the Congo, which I find really interesting and curious, and some other just sort of broad West African diaspora. So yeah, so that's how I am racialized in the US. And I think that my understanding of race actually came somewhat later in life because my family didn't really talk about race when I was growing up. And I grew up looking out, not necessarily looking at myself. So what I saw was a bunch of white people, and I was working as hard as I could to fit in, not necessarily recognizing that they would always see me as different. My understanding of race sort of happened as I was answering that question around belonging and feeling the wounds of belonging that came from being racialized and being different than so many of my peers, and also not being part of the predominant faith. That was another thing that kind of kept me from full belonging. And so that continues to be a main anchor in my work, is really around belonging and what's the work we can do internally to reclaim the parts of ourselves that we might have disowned in order to fit in, and how when we claim that internal belonging, we can actually belong anywhere.
By listening to what you're saying, if I have a better understanding of your background, your mother is white and your father is Black, and you happen to see yourself as a Black woman. Is it
Mhm.
something society imposed up on you, or is something you choose? Because saying you are a Black, in many ways, we will say you are mixed on my own
Yeah.
view. So which one is it? Is it imposed by
Yeah.
society, or you just happen to say this is the path I'm going, racial path I'm going to choose?
Yeah. Well, I also identify as biracial for sure. Identify as biracial and identify as Black. And I think, I mean, race in the US is so complex. So, because of the ways we privilege bodies that are more European, right? Like the closer you come to that quote unquote ideal, then the more access to resources, the more privileges, the more, beautiful you are considered. So being biracial and having light skin is certainly a privilege, in the US, right? Based on how things are structured. And at the same time, when folks look at me, depending on their experience and exposure to race, I think Black folks would look at me and say, oh, this is a mixed race person. But where I was growing up, which was predominantly white, very conservative, kind of sheltered, I wasn't treated as a mixed race person. I was treated as a Black person. Because, and you'll see this in other conservative sort of monolithic cultures where everything gets kind of compressed to a binary. And that binary is either you're Black or you're white. And you could be Asian, you could be Latino, you could be Filipino. And this is crazy, right, to think this, but I've seen it where people who are of these from these cultures will get racialized as Black because race gets compressed to the binary of either you're one of us, right? Either you're one of us or you're other. And
Mm.
that other becomes Blackness because Blackness is the opposite of quote unquote us.
I'm kind of imagining, making imaginations about you in the circle of your family growing up. I believe your father or your mother, they don't, they will not kind of judge you based on race. They see you as a child, as a human being.
Yeah.
When did you realize in many ways you are not a human, but you are you belong to a race? When that, in which period of your life, growing
Mm-hmm.
up in your family, in that environment, nobody judging you based on race, and you
Mm-hmm.
escape, you cross that boundary, and suddenly you face a judgment that say, Kels, you are Black. When did
Yeah.
you recall that moment?
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple that stand out, but probably the earliest was in elementary school being called the N-word, by a classmate. And I must have been in fourth grade, maybe third or fourth grade. So that's around 8, 9, that I was called the N-word
Mm.
by a classmate. And I remember being so shocked by that,
Mm.
because, like you're saying, I didn't really think about race. I just was in my family and was just, loved and part of the family unit. So that was the first time I felt singled out because of my race. Um, and then the student actually assaulted me, and pulled out a knife and started to chase me with it. And I was so embarrassed. I mean, I had so much shame around that.
Mm.
Um, I didn't tell anybody what had happened. And then my best friend who was with me, and this is someone who was white, told her mom when we got home what had happened. And her mom called my parents and told my parents what had happened. And my parents were like, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you tell us? And I couldn't really even answer the question. I just was so embarrassed. I was so embarrassed that there was something different about me. And rather than feeling like, oh, what this person did was wrong, I felt like, oh, this person called out something deficient about me that I didn't see. And now I need to hide because I don't want to be seen as deficient, right? And, you know, when I reflect on my life, my early years, there were a lot of experiences of me being racialized differently than my classmates, but I didn't read it as a racial discrimination. I read it as there's something wrong with me. Why won't they play with me? Why do they pick on me? Why are they why are they pulling my hair? Why do they tease about my hair? Why, you know, and I didn't think about this as being about race. I just thought, oh, you know, I need to work harder to fit in. I need to get my hair a different way. I need to have the right clothes. I need to whatever, whatever, whatever. And it didn't occur to me as a child, oh, all my classmates. And this went back to preschool, you know, so really early on having these impacts, but it wasn't until I was, you know, called the N-word when I was, you know, in elementary school that I really felt the sort of like blow of that. And it was shame that I felt and embarrassment.
I see. I guess at certain point your parents knew about it and your school as well. What did they do to deal with this kind of challenges?
You know, this was the 80s, and so there wasn't the same awareness around racial justice and equity and inclusion that there is now. So I don't think anything happened. I mean, I know that this kid, I still remember his name. He had to write me an apology letter. And I remember he showed up at my house, and my parents had me answer the door. And when I saw him there, I was so scared, you know, and I don't remember there being any adults with me, like, hey, Kelsey, you know, like, let this child is going to apologize to what he did. It was wrong. I remember they just said, answer the door. And so I answered the door and he was there. And I remember being shocked, you know, like scared. And then he handed me a letter and his head, he was very bent over. He wouldn't look at me directly. And then he just kind of ran away. And the letter was like, you know, an apology. And it was very, you know, it was written by an elementary school kid. So it wasn't, I wouldn't say like super sincere. It was like, I'm sorry for pulling a knife on you after school and calling you the N-word, you know, it was something like that. And again, like how I felt about that wasn't like relief. I felt like, oh, his parents made him do this or the school made him do this. But once again, I'm being signaled out as like different and that there's something wrong with me or there's something less than about me. And so I just wanted to push the whole experience under the rug and go on being a kid and pretend it didn't happen.
It's quite an interesting story. And what I kind of getting is instead viewing these actions of discrimination, of racial bias has something wrong, you basically just see yourself as somebody who should improve on pleasing other people.
That's right.
And you went, I'm guessing also you went through life, you know, acting in that frame. When the shift happened, when did you realize that what they did was wrong and you need to be yourself?
Mm.
And who put you in that? Do you have any person who put you in that, or any book or any association that put you in that revolutionary path?
Yeah. Well, I feel like I'm still on that path, to tell you the truth, Alpha. I'm still unlearning the ways I've been colonized, right? The things I've internalized. But there was one thing that happened when I was really young. I was maybe 14, and I write about this in the book, that my mom took me to see Maya Angelou speak when I was about 14. And I remember she spoke at like the local college, and it was a full auditorium. And I remember being one of the only Black people there, at least as far as I could see. There probably were a few others, but we were certainly in like the minority, quite a bit. And so Maya Angelou came out to the podium, and she was so dignified in how she held herself. She was so upright, so unapologetic, right? So there was so much, she was so regal, and she was wearing, like a scarf around her head, and a beautiful, colorful print. But it certainly was more African inspired clothing, not what the sort of popular styles were of the day. And she came out, and I remember being mortified for her. I remember feeling like, oh my goodness, look at this Black woman who's so different, and everyone is going to laugh at her. But she stood there at that podium, and before she spoke, she just looked at this audience. I imagine she saw this sea of white faces. And the look on her face was like, I am about to give you something so remarkable, and I am just excited for you to receive it. It was like she was savoring what she was about to offer us. And then she recited her poem, and there was just so much dignity in how she conveyed herself. And obviously she had such a beautiful command of language, and it was inspiring. I was so inspired by her. And I felt for the first time proud to share something with this woman, proud that we were both the same in some way. That was a real turning point for me. And I started reading her poetry. I would go to the Barnes and Noble and sit on the floor and read her poems. And I think that's when I started to feel, it wasn't that I rushed into claiming my Blackness, because again, this was the early 90s. But something pierced through there where I could reclaim a part of my identity that I had been, up until that point, really ashamed of.
By listening to what you are saying, we can acknowledge that race and color play a big part in your life, and and you decided basically to write about it. But before taking the initiative of writing a book, how long it take you to mature the idea of wanting to say something? Because many people basically they have ideas, but they don't see the need to write a book. And you basically you had an idea, you see the need of writing. How long it take you, that process?
You know, it's interesting what happened with this whole process, because so little of it was actually planned. I started working with women of color as a coach, and really looking at the impacts of intergenerational trauma. And I started to see kind of themes show up in my clients over and over again. And that sparked this idea of offering something where we could all come together and feel less alone in these challenges we were grappling. And a lot of these themes have now gotten more attention in the media. So like overextending ourselves, not being able to make boundaries, not having enough time to rest, not making time for pleasure or even knowing what pleasure is, sensing that our bodies are communicating with us, but not really knowing how to access what's happening in our bodies. These sort of like themes are showing up. And so I started a course really with the intention of building community and having these deeper conversations. And from there, a publisher actually reached out to me and said, would you be interested in writing a book about this? And I was like, sure, And so that was the process. And on some level, I always knew that I was going to write a book, but I probably would have in some ways got in my own way around producing producing your first book. There's a lot of internal stuff that you're facing. And so I was very fortuitous to have the support of a publisher to get me through that process. And now that I've navigated it, I feel more confident in, how I could do it moving forward.
I see. Decolonizing the Body. Why the title?
Yeah, so the title came, again, that's interesting. One of my good friends, Chetna Mehta, who runs the Instagram feed Mosaic Eye, and she had come to in Oakland. I used to teach this embodiment course for artists, activists, and dabblers with my friend Annie Rose London. And she had come to that offering a few times and then built a following around her work and invited me to be a guest author in her newsletter, and with the title of "Will You Write About Decolonizing the Body?" And I was like, interesting, this idea of decolonizing the body. And as I was writing that article, it felt like, oh, this is what my work is about. Like all of these patterns that I'm looking at in the women that I work with are patterns that we've learned that go back generations. How have we become so disconnected from our bodies, right? How we become so disconnected from ritual, how we become so disconnected from our ability to trust ourselves and trust our intuition. Why have we learned that we don't deserve to take up space, or that we have to earn, the ability to be heard through getting the appropriate credentials and etc., right? And all of these patterns root back to what is required of a population when a dominant power comes into that country and asserts control, right? There's it's obviously the sequestering of land and resources, but it's also disconnecting that population from their own power and putting them to use in service to the dominating powers agenda. and to assert power over people and disconnect them from their own inherent power requires a disconnecting from our own bodies, right? Because that disconnection from the body is the disconnection from our land, right? So the ways that we've learned to adapt inside of that inhospitable environment are these patterns that we've come by honestly, that have supported our survival and supported the survival of our ancestors, but they've come at a cost, and they've come at the cost of our own wholeness, right? So decolonizing the body is looking at, well, what are those patterns and what are they costing me? And what is the journey to reclaiming what has been lost?
So when you talk about body, are you making a difference between races or genders, or you're talking the body as whole?
Yeah. So the body as a whole, most certainly. However, those patterns that we learn differ based on the society that we're in. So what the patterns I learn as a Black woman are different than the patterns you would learn as an African man, and are different than what a white-bodied male would learn. That's not to say that there are not overlaps, right? There's going to be overlaps in our experience. And at the same time, there are going to be distinctions. And so being someone who's coming from my lens, it felt imperative for me to speak from what I know. And at the same time, invite in others to be a part of the conversation and to listen for how these systems and how these stories are impacting their own bodies, because I imagine there's a lot of resonance. So yes, the body as a whole, but then I'm also speaking to a particular subsection based on my lens.
What about the gender issue in this topic? Do you, by writing your book, did you basically see the male gender as dictating, as a colonizer, and the female gender has been colonized, or is not the case at all?
Yeah, I like to think of these systems as kind of like a multi-headed hydra. And so that's kind of like a Greek myth term, but a hydra is like, it has one body and it has multiple heads. It's like a monster with one body and multiple heads. And you can chop off one head, but if the other heads remain alive, then the monster is still imposing, right? And so I think about racism, capitalism, transphobia, patriarchy. I mean, we could go on, Islamophobia, blah, blah, blah. All of these isms as a multi-headed hydra, in that they have a different name, but they support each other. They support each other. And so we can't get rid of racism completely and still have patriarchy and capitalism, right? Like there's arguments around the fact that there isn't actually capitalism. There's racialized capitalism just because of the way that capitalism is structured, right? It's not sustainable. So it requires a valuing of bodies in order to be in continual production, in order to continually accrue more and more and more resources. And so because it requires that sort of hierarchical ranking of bodies, the way that we have as a Western society determine which bodies have value is based on race. So in and of itself, capitalism has racism baked into it. So all of these systems support each other. So I like to think of it, what I call it in my book is the program. and we're all shaped by the program, right? Even men, right? Even queer bodies, even my immigrant bodies, we're all impacted by these systems that we live in.
Yeah, but me personally, I know sometimes we grow up in societies with their own reality, but we also, as an individual, we have a responsibility to defy society and impose our own will, even though the challenge can be difficult. Personally, whenever I meet a person, despite, for instance, let's take United States of America, we are classified as a black, white, Spanish, Asian, and things. But my perspective on that is I see people as a human, and I refuse to see you as white or as a black, despite the society is imposing me its will. But I, as an act of rebellion, I see people as a human, because I don't want to dive into the race issue. And often when you identify yourself as a race, to a race, you have tendency to belong, and belonging and supporting. And sometimes when you belong to the tribe, even the tribe is wrong, you have difficulties to challenge them. And for me, the best way to take myself from that polemic is to see people as a human. Through your process of writing this book, what is the message you wanted to share to the world?
Yeah. I think, it's such a good question. I wrote this book for folks who may be impacting or may be impacted, but not realize the impacts are global and not personal failings. So one of the things that happens inside the program is any ways that we don't measure up to the ideal, we internalize as being something deficient about ourselves, right? So these are the impacts of internalized depression. But you might be experiencing internalized depression and not be a politicized person and not understand or have made that connection that your interiority or the emotional body is very much shaped by the systems that we live in. And so without that connection, then you continue to strive to be better, right? You continue to strive to, one way that we can see this with male bodies, but really all bodies in general, is this sort of like pressure to be a success, quote unquote. And if you're not a success, which is defined as like having a lot of resources, then there's something wrong with you, right? Like you didn't work hard enough. And so to hopefully puncture those narratives that can run inside of us, and ultimately they run inside of us because they propagate the program itself. They keep us from fighting the system because we're internally fighting ourselves. And so what I'm hoping is that in reading this book, folks can start to recognize the ways in which the program has shaped our own internal narratives, and that we're not alone. We're not alone in that challenge, and that we are fundamentally whole, and there's nothing wrong with us, and we have beauty and brilliance. And when we can come together and recognize that, we are a huge threat to the program. We are a huge threat to the systems we live inside of.
So basically, you asking the society to overlook the differences and embrace each other, because you believe we are all the same and unity is the solution.
I think, yes, on a grand scale, I think we could go there. But as I said, like I predominantly am working with bodies of color, because who are the bodies that designed the systems that we live in, right? I do believe that we all are here for, we have something to offer in what will ultimately contribute to humanity's ability to survive, right? I don't disagree with that prospect. And at the same time, I believe that it's the marginalized many, so most of us, the global majority, right, who are impacted by these systems that we did not create, who actually are going to have the vision, the insights, the lived experience to help illumine a path forward that is beyond what we're experiencing right now. So yes, we all have to come together, but our roles are different. Some bodies need to step back and do less and make space for others. And other bodies need to feel supported, like that they're not alone, that they have a lot to offer and contribute, that their natural gifts are welcome and needed to come forward, right? And what I guess I'm suggesting is that those bodies are the most marginalized among us.
Miss Kelsey Blackwell, due to the time, I would like to again say thank you very much for joining me on the Human Rights Tree. The conversation is to be continued, and I look forward to reaching out again in the near future to talk more about your book. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alpha. This was a great conversation.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.